so I followed that concept, and tried to get input from musicians about it. But I had an idea of something that I thought would be beneficial that they didn't have. They didn't ask me for a headless bass. They didn't come in and want a custom instrument without a headstock. I mean, forget it.
I'm very pleased to have legendary instrument designer Ned Steinberger as our special guest on this week's episode of Life with Strings Attached. With a remarkable 40-year legacy, Ned Steinberger has been at the forefront of innovation with instruments that have revolutionized the industry and set new standards of performance for ergonomics and comfort. His instruments have been adopted by an impressive list of artists, such as Sting, Laurie Anderson, Les Claypool, David Darling, Tony Levin, Rob Wasserman, Eddie Van Halen, and many, many others. Born in 1948, the son of an artist mother and a Nobel Prize-winning physicist father, Ned set up his first wood shop at the age of 13, and after majoring in sculpture at Maryland Institute College of Art, went on to design furniture and cabinetry. Some of Ned's early furniture designs are still being manufactured today. Ned's first instrument to meet major public acceptance was the Spectre NS bass guitar, designed in 1976. With its distinctive curved body, both front and back, the Spectre NS series has become a recognized classic and continues to enjoy wide popularity to this day. Perhaps his most infamous contribution, Ned pioneered headless graphite instruments to worldwide acclaim. The Steinberger Bass received numerous awards, including the coveted Design of the Decade Award from the Industrial Designer Society of America. His Trans-Trem, a unique transposing vibrato unit that allows strings to remain in tune with each other rather than detuned randomly, has been adopted by other notable guitar makers such as Steve Klein and Ulrich Teufel. As if this wasn't enough, Ned's other designs include electronic tuners, tuning hardware, structural systems, and accessories for companies such as D'Addario, David Gage, and the Martin Guitar Company. Apart from the fretted, Ned's NS Design Company is one of the few companies to have gained success in the ultra-conservative bowed instrument market with patents on double bass and violins. There are few people who can boast of such widespread influence across musical instruments and genres as Ned Steinberger can. I truly enjoyed my conversation with him, and I hope that you do as much as I did. Hello, Ned. Thank you for being on Life with Strings Attached. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, actually, and I'm excited to be having this opportunity to speak with you. So it's all good.
Great. How are things there in Maine? Am I correct? You're in Maine?
I am in Maine, and it's drizzling for the fourth day in a row with very high humidity, and we don't live with air conditioning up here. We haven't in the past, although we're starting to think about maybe we better get an air conditioner because the temperature is rising, and we feel it here in Maine. We're very fortunate that we somehow managed to escape these catastrophic storms and everything. We've really been unaffected by that. Even in nearby Vermont, they have major flooding and everything. But here in Maine, we are sort of in this little oasis, but it's still impacting our weather here big time. It's changing and getting warmer, and which is great in the wintertime. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not great for the planet. Don't get me wrong. I'm not approving of global warming. So it can be warmer in winter in Maine in the winter, but still, it's being a little warmer here is no harm done as far as our local community here. So.
I think if you're going to recognize the bad, you also have to be able to recognize the good, to be honest with yourself. And it's okay. There are people in very cold climates who are not so bothered by it getting a degree warmer. And it's okay to say that. I don't think that.
And also, I realized too, after I said that really is not true, because there's a lot of negative impact of this warming in Maine in the winter as well. The flora and fauna are impacted in ways that are potentially quite problematic. So I retract my statement. So we're starting off this interview with denials immediately, whatever. So, but I have a sister who is very environmentally conscious and
Yeah.
active and so on. And she would be appalled by what I just said. So I
Well,
go on the record as correcting myself.
yeah, that's all right. So I think that this is actually very relevant because, we're talking about changes to what's normal. We're talking about perspectives as to how people view those things also. And your work has been some of those potential sort of major changes or seismic shifts, within the guitar market, and I'm often reminded by, there was an article that talked about the Swiss watchmakers, and it opened up by saying the quartz crisis to the Swiss and the quartz revolution to everyone else. And 70% of Swiss watchmakers went out of business in the 1970s.
Because
and only one American company remained because of the quartz
time. Right, it is what you're saying.
Quartz was simply more efficient. You didn't have to wind it. It was more accurate. It was an evolutionary sort of step. It simply is a much, much better system. And the Swiss watchmakers shifted. They started to market themselves to luxury. They started to talk about the handmade nature of it and mechanical movements. And they somewhat fetishized mechanics and so made a category of mechanical.
These high-end watches, if I may ask, they're mechanical then. They're not like just a lot of gold around the top, but still digitally driven. But they're more.
Oh no! Like a Rolex, a Tag Heuer, and many of the much bigger sort of brands. Those Swiss watches that they're talking about are mechanical movements that you have to wind. There's not a battery in them. And so it's
interesting sales proposition. To get people to prefer that is interesting. It's also interesting the history of, the importance of timekeeping in navigation, for example, and the development of the, chronometer and really being able to know your time within a nanosecond, even though you're out on a ship bouncing around on the sea and you got this mechanical device. Great challenge and achievement in the mechanical age. But of course, some things are no longer really, it just, we have different technology now, so it's all interesting.
But there's still the human capacity for sort of romanticizing, periods, work in particular. So, and I saw one of our hosts from the Boutique Guitar Showcase down in well, I guess I shouldn't maybe name specifically where they are, but one of our American tour hosts was recently on vacation in Switzerland, and I saw that he went to do like a watch building class in Switzerland when he was in Geneva. And he went and visited the Philippe Patek, I think is the name of the watchmaker, very luxurious watchmaker, and he's obviously into it in the same way that people are into collecting guitars or classic cars or whatever it happens to be. There's a period you relate to and you're into that. And, the part that I really was trying to highlight there in connection with the environment, not to get ourselves into trouble here, is that you had the same situation happening, and one called it the quartz crisis and one called it the quartz revolution. And that often there are major shifts in our world, perhaps in our environment, where there's someone in a desert who's starting to get more water, and that's a really damn good thing for them. As a matter of fact, we have a problem right now. Well, I think a problem. That's my perspective. That somewhere in the Middle East, they've learned how to trigger rain. They're sending up, I forget whether it's planes, and they're Oh, I don't know anything about it. Hang on a second here. But they're doing something up in the air, perhaps with electricity or something like that. And they're triggering like the
So it
condensation,
rains on
causing
your
clouds to
property, but
form with the vapor in the air.
not on the country.
That,
Right? Is that right?
that's right. That rain was scheduled to go somewhere, but tell somebody in the desert they can't have the water. That's a challenge, right?
Well, there's all kinds of interesting things that are come to my mind with this conversation. I'm reminded why I enjoy speaking with you, Jamie. So, but it's one thing to collect watches or chronometers that come from a previous era, all right, which is one thing. It's another thing to want to buy a new one that is made in that way when in fact it makes no sense to make it that way anymore. So not that relates at all to the guitar business. No, definitely not.
Well, it does because there's a reenactment there. So, I on the extremes,
I respect that. I do. I want to be clear on that. I do.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's obvious to anybody who knows anything about your work that you are somebody who is, a futurist. You're driving improvement. You want functional improvements that it's happening, and you're not romantically tied to the icon of the guitar. But when we're selling guitars, which is a part of what you and I must do in order to fund our work also, is that there are people who are looking to experience new possibilities, who are looking to remove limitations perhaps they might perceive within functioning of previous designs. And there are those who are looking to relive the moment because they were inspired by a particular musician, whether it was Jimi Hendrix or Bob Dylan or someone much more recent than that. And that's why they play guitar, and their whole life is to relive that moment over and over again. So they want their guitar, they want that amplifier, they want the culture around that.
Yeah, clearly.
But it's very clear to you and me that that's not what drives you or I. we're the future side of things. We recognize. I love where we've been, but I'm mostly excited about where we're going.
Well, I'm excited by all of it, and especially where we're going. Sure, I mean that's where, and I'm excited about my own work, and it means a lot to me, and sharing that work and so on. But a musical instrument is not something that you can really quantify very easily as what good or bad. I mean, I've made this analogy too many times, but you make a racing car and you bring it out to the racetrack and you win or you lose, and it's not the way it is with guitars. It's everybody's got a different idea what they want. There's no way to say one is better than the other, really. It's personal taste, and the truth is that there is a big repertoire of music out there for guitars, acoustic guitars, electric guitars, and of course, especially the rock and roll revolution of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so maybe 90s, wherever you want to draw the line. I mean, that this was all part and parcel of the development of the electric guitar, and a great deal of music was created with your Fenders, with your Gibsons. Mm-hmm. So if you love that music and you enjoy playing the music of your idols, or what an idol is, it sounds a little negative. I don't mean to be your hero, whatever, someone you really love their music and you want to play their music, why would you play it on a different instrument? Doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. On some level, I mean, there's a logic in playing it with a similar instrument, but that's just the reality of the market. I'm very well aware of it over the years, and so it's interesting because for me, what that means for me, first of all, being pretty much, a lot of the instruments I've been making, especially bowed electric instruments, have headstocks.
Mm-hmm.
I remember building a prototype of an upright bass because I wanted to, these are going to be, the string family, violin, viola, cello, and double bass, right? So, and I was very excited about making a double bass because it's got a really long string, and if you want to have a bass, the longer the string, the better. And as far as tone goes, for sure, you get more harmonics, get more clarity. You still have that driving fundamental, even more clear, and so on. So long strings are good. That's why we have multi-scale instruments and so on, to try to get those lower strings to resonate at their optimum, to optimize the lower strings. So that's been, a very exciting exploration for me. And, it is led to an evolution in my work, but nowadays I'm getting back into guitars, which I'm excited about. So this is something I'm very glad to have a chance to talk guitars. But I also want to point out that there's a lot to be said for these bowed electric instruments, which I remain very excited about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that. I think that's a bigger challenge than the guitar market, to with the bowed electric instruments, and admittedly, I don't know as much about it, but it certainly is mostly sustained by reenactment. So from what I understand, something like 99% of all music performed by symphony orchestras are from 4 composers. And all of those 4 composers have been dead for hundreds of years. And so it's great music, but it is absolutely tied to a period and a reenactment and the sustaining of that period. And there's a concerted effort. I mean, there are philanthropists. There are people who dedicate their lives to making sure that period basically doesn't go away. It's sustained by people who love it and who literally invest their money in making sure that other people learn to love it.
And getting back to how that relates to instruments, for example, you have Baroque music, and you could play it on a modern acoustic violin, with the steel strings and all this other stuff that they didn't have back in the Baroque age. Or you can play on original instruments. And people are really into that, and that makes a lot of sense. And so what's interesting is it has a very strong correlation to our world, which is, guitars, and especially my world, which is primarily electric guitars. There's a repertoire there. Very parallel. So you want to play, this certain tune that so-and-so, you love so much, was played on a Fender Strat. Well, it's a no-brainer. You play it on a Fender Strat.
Yeah, if you want a reenactment. So, I remember going to one of our tour stops, again in America, with the Boutique Guitar Showcase. And of course, we bring in instruments. When I curate a show, I try and have modern instruments with different ideas. I also have instruments which are referencing classic guitars as well. And I remember one of the younger store staff, who's very intelligent, a great musician, well experienced, say, yeah, but you can't play rock and roll on that. And I looked at him and said, you have no idea what rock and roll is. I said, rock and roll is an attitude, and you can play rock and roll whatever the fuck you want to play rock and roll on. And that is the least rock and roll thing you could possibly say. You are a reenactment, but you have lost the spirit of rock and roll. And that is a nonconformist spirit. So the idea that you have to conform to play a rock guitar is the least fucking rock and roll thing you could ever say in your entire life. he looks stunned. I wasn't really aggressive with him, but I was trying to give him the spirit of rock and roll to let him know.
I'm not stunned. I find it humorous. I didn't know I was allowed to use the word "fuck" on this interview, but now I know.
This is a private. Oh yeah, you're an East Coaster, man. That's like a comma to you.
I mean, this is not primetime TV. I guess I was hoping it would be, but I guess not. Anyway, just being silly, of course. And
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com.
But again, tradition is very important in music and in musical instruments, and the repertoire and what was used to create the original music. I don't want to critique that in any way. That is basically, extremely essential, and part of our musical world is having songs that are taken down by the over the ages. Okay, so you could be a brilliant, artist, musician, and create all these new songs that really are great, but it's going to be hard to get anybody to connect with them. It's a big challenge because people want to hear familiar tunes, things they know and love, and I don't blame them. I'm the same way. So it's a big challenge to create new music. And back in the 70s and 60s, 70s, 80s with rock and roll, it was so powered by the electric guitar and bass, right? I mean, would you agree with that? I mean, it was part of it was this was, oh my God. And then you have this amplifier that's incapable of actually reproducing the sound of the guitar at the level you want to. And the next thing you know, I love it. It's distorted. It's thick.
Yes.
It's a whole new world, right? So this was a time of exploration, time of innovation, pioneering spirit. But it's hard at a certain point when you sort of, these days, a lot of that has been explored. You can't really make a whole new fun thing using distortion. It's been done already. You got to come up with something else.
Yeah, but it was all a mistake.
Challenging, I don't know.
It was all a mistake. It was all design failures. Yes, because they were trying to reenact. They weren't making electric guitars to sound like something new. They were making electric guitars to solve a volume and sustain issue as audiences got larger, as television happened, as radio happened, and such. And we went from smaller venues to larger venues, but they were trying to make a guitar sound like an acoustic guitar, because that's what a guitar was. There wasn't anything else, right? And so they weren't trying to make something new. And even the Marshall with the most famous distortion amplifier was trying to make an affordable Fender.
You don't agree with that? Leo Fender was trying to imitate an acoustic guitar. That's his.
No, he wasn't by that point, but he came 40 years after we were trying to make electric guitars. Decades late. He's just the one who got it right in the commercial set.
Well, and it's pretty amazing to look at how
it is.
75
Don't get me wrong.
Years later, it's still the most popular guitar in the world. I mean, you got to give him credit. And I think a lot of the reason that's true is because it's one thing to imitate an acoustic guitar. It's another thing to say, well, let's see what an electric guitar could be, and why do we have to, do all these things the same? We can just take a block of wood and chop some holes in it and stick a neck on there and bolt it on, God bless them. And got a brand new world, extremely practical. He's my hero in this.
Brilliant.
It's interesting when I say that too, because when I first looked at Fender guitars, I thought they were pretty dumb looking, and that's part of what motivated me to think of how else could you make a guitar, electric guitar. But over the years, I just come to respect Leo more and more. So
I have a huge amount of respect for him. Please don't take that as a disrespect. But
no,
at one
I
point
didn't
in time,
take it
we
as
were
a
just trying to make a
disrespect. It was just an
guitar.
opportunity
There was
for
no
me to
such thing
express my
as an
appreciation
electric guitar.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's what I mean, is that there was actually no such thing as electric guitar. We were just trying to make a guitar louder. What are we trying to make louder? The guitar. If it doesn't sound like the guitar, did we make a guitar? Right? And so the initial thing was to try and make that thing, but louder. And that thing was only acoustic instruments at that point in time, right? And it slowly evolves, something through intentional design, but also through unintended consequence. And when I tried to chart out the evolution of guitar, what I realized is at first I made the assumption that it was about intentional design, but over and over again, I saw unintentional consequences are actually the driving force that happens. So if we want to say, I think we can agree that the sound of not rock and roll, but the sound of rock music is defined primarily by a Marshall, a distorted guitar, right? A distorted guitar, which is driven by a humbucker, which is driven, really the icon of it is a Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin. This is the one that most people are pointing back.
Wait, you're saying there's no rock and roll on single coil? I mean, I don't know about that.
I know. Let me make the point here. So yes. The point is the humbucker was not meant to distort anything. It was meant to get rid of that 60 cycle hum, right? However, It also drove things louder, which sort of the amplifiers, when nobody was looking for distortion. Even Jim Marshall was trying to make it clean. He was trying to make a Fender in the UK they could afford.
Really?
And in his later life, he would embarrass the shit out of the Marshall people by actively telling people the best amplifier he ever heard was a Fender Twin. The people, the Marshall guys at the back of the room would always like, oh, you got to stop saying that.
I mean, I have a much smaller operation, but I'm constantly making gaffes that might. Why did you say that? Whatever.
But the point is, he wasn't trying to make it distorted. He was trying to make it clean and didn't. It was a failure that the musicians went, oh, this is interesting. And the same thing happened with the humbucker and the Les Paul. He's a jazz player. It was designed for jazz players. They didn't take rock and roll seriously. It was designed for the jazz market, and they never accepted it. It took the Les Paul with humbuckers through an amplifier that wasn't supposed to distort. These three unintended consequences are literally the sound of rock, and it drove it. And it's the people who always decide, the musicians who always decide. And the establishment of the day who wanted to reenact something said, why am I going to stop playing my 175 or my L5 or my D'Angelico or whatever it happened to be?
Well, I would disagree with you on one point, and that is that the musicians, of course, are the creators, but the audience gets to decide as well, because if the audience didn't love rock and roll, we wouldn't be talking about it. So,
of course, they don't get to hear the musicians aren't inspired by it in the first place.
I mean, pardon the pun, resonated with people, and everybody got excited, and it would never have been possible without the electric guitar and bass. So that's fun, right? I mean, that's
I totally agree. I'm just talking about the evolution of how it arrived there. It's a lot more unintended consequences with people who are willing to explore.
Your point
and it's the exploring musicians that made your career. And so let's bring this back to you for a second, because the people who first accepted your very unusual instruments, which seem to be very much breaking from the icon, you've broken from the curves, you've broken from the violin, you've broken from all of these things with your very first design, which gained success. Let's talk about the Steinberger design for a moment, the Steinberger bass, and then the guitar. It was accepted by exploring musicians, right?
I certainly, for those people who are very traditionally oriented, they were not interested in that. Definitely not. But right. Yeah, there's a lot of, times change too, because I was fortunate in the late 70s and early 80s. There was a lot of interest and excitement about new technology for guitars and basses and so on. And it was remarkable for me to see how that changed over the course of the 80s. And by the time you got to 1990, it's like everybody was like totally vintage oriented. I mean, it's more complicated than that. This is just my own experience as it related to what was happening with my work and what I put out there for people. I am very impressed in retrospect at how willing bass players and guitar players were to something that radically different. Much more so, by the way.
How did that happen?
People in the business, they all knew I was crazy and that they would never sell any of this stuff. Okay. So I got in early on, I had, different reactions to what I was doing. Some people, were kind of rude about their disdain for what I was doing, let's say, but other people were supportive. That's wonderful. I hate to tell you, you're never going to get to sell that stuff. It's never going to work, right? So there was sympathy with it. Anyway, it was musicians who said, I'm kind of curious about that. You know what? And I've referred to this too many times, but in my experience as presenting new things to people, I look for that kind of confused gleam in the eye where it's sort of like, what's that? And that's pretty interesting or whatever. You get that, and you also get other people who are going, get that out of my face. I don't want anything to do with it, right? And which I respect that too, but of course I'm interested in those folks who have that gleam in their eye, and I want to talk to them and learn about what excites them. And anyway, it was a big stretch. Here I came out with this bass guitar with a pivot plate on the back, for God's sake. I mean, how could you possibly imagine that any self-respecting bass player would play this bass? It was so bizarre on some level. So I'm very well aware of the conservative nature of musicians around. They played this instrument their whole life, and they don't want something different. They want their baby, and they want to stay with it. No, that cool. But a lot of players were really willing to stretch in a way that I think it took some courage on their part, or took some curiosity or interest in exploring new things. And those are the folks who would become engaged with playing Steinberger bass, for example. And
it's the innovators. They're not reenactors. They're innovators, and then the early adopters. In marketing terms, we talk about these specifically as innovators are the first 2%. The next 13.5% are early adopters, and you have to saturate that first sort of 15.5% or 16.5%. I think is actually the numbers in order to get into the majority. So until you saturate that part of it, the majority won't even touch it, and so. But you've lived that. You watched it happen. But it was those explorers who were going to do it, Yeah, amazing.
And a small business like I have, or what I did back then, with Steinberger Sound, I didn't need a majority, There's a lot of musicians out there that buy a lot of instruments. If 20% of them are interested in your instrument, that's pretty good.
20's a lot.
Yeah, or 10% or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying they bought it, okay? That's another story. But even have an interest in it. In other words, even if 80% of the market is oriented very differently, that 20% that isn't at least got an ear to what's going on that you're involved with, and that's still a lot of people, a lot of guitars.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I meet guitar makers all the time who are concerned about the amount of guitar makers there are these days, because there's a lot of young guitar makers, a lot of people getting into making guitar, not even young. Some of them are older it's their second or third career, and they're wanting to do this because they love the guitar and they romanticize the idea of working in a workshop and making something, and that's what they want to do with their lives now. So there are a lot more guitar makers these days, it seems, and people are worried about it. And
who's worried about it in what way? That there's going to not be enough work for
there's not enough business for them. Exactly. Yeah. But, I remind them exactly that. We're talking about your market is something like 2% of the global guitar market. But what is the global guitar market? The last time I spoke to an executive at Taylor, which is a few years ago, they were making 750 guitars per day. That's just Taylor.
Yeah.
Never mind Martin, Gibson, Fender. Yamaha makes more than all of them combined. It's there are so many guitars being bought and sold every day that, if you're an independent guitar maker, and you're going to make, I work on the average of 17.5 guitars a year. If you take acoustic guitar makers and electric guitar makers and you meld them together for their averages, if you make 17 guitars a year, you don't need to find that many people. And if you make them in a unique and interesting way, then your market is global. If you make a copy of something, then your market is likely local. So
that's interesting. That's a very interesting observation. I hadn't thought of that before, but that must be true. Makes perfect sense to me, even though I hadn't put it in those terms.
So it's a fraction of a percent that you need to actually worry about to feed you and your business. Your business is bigger than an individual guitar maker. You have multiple people involved in your company at this stage in the game.
Individual guitar maker is another story again.
Yeah.
And that's how do you think I think it's a great thing for there to be individual guitar makers and have. Mm-hmm. It's not a way to. Every once in a while you might find an individual guitar maker who has some kind of great talent that's extraordinary, and that also maybe is a good promoter and all of that, and then they all of a sudden it swells into something with a whole other dimension to it. But that's not the case for most individual guitar makers. And it's how do you think these guys are faring? You're so much more connected to the marketplace than I am, and I would hope that they could make their individual guitars and maybe not get rich, but still put food on the table. But that's not so easy, is it?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to make that happen. Many of them are not thriving, truth be told. They're barely making it. Most of the ones that I work with are, of course, actually sustaining themselves, and some of them are thriving, but it's about creating demand. It's supply and demand, just like anything else is. And so, there are guitar makers who sell their guitars in low quantities for very high dollars. And then you can sustain your life, but if you're trying to compete with the factory guitar and making them one at a time in a very inefficient way, that's a bad choice.
Compete with
hard go. But some people do. They think that a guitar has to be, and when I say factory guitar, I mean they're trying to make guitars at $2,000, like selling at $2,000 or $3,000, which is more expensive than the average mom and pop music store actually inventories. I get that, but in the handmade side, that's sort of the bottom of where we are. In the boutique guitar showcase, if we take 50 guitars on tour and we divide the selling prices by 50, we end up with an average of $10,000. On the boutique guitar showcase tour, which is much higher than
$10,000 that the purchaser pays.
That's right, an average. We have guitars that are maybe $3,000 or $4,000, and we might also have a guitar that's $50,000 or $60,000 on the tour also. And so you just divide 50 guitars. Yeah, you get a mean.
Do you? That's after the guitar is sold, it goes into the equation, or that it's being offered sets the number, because that's a little.
The selling price. We don't negotiate at all prices on boutique guitars. If you have a high demand, you don't need to discount. But
you're saying you have an average price, okay? Or if I understood it correctly. So, and somebody wants to sell something for, something is being sold for 60, and somebody else is selling for 4. Okay, let's say as a widest range, right? So when you add up when you say what the average is the average based on what is offered or on what is actually sold?
Oh, it's based on what's on offer.
Matters that much. I was just
so there are 50 guitars with prices ranging from 3,000 or 4,000 up to, let's say, 60 or 70,000.
The average price of the guitar being
you add up all the prices, you divide it by the 50 units, you end up with somewhere between 10 and 13,000. Each tour is a little bit different depending on which guitars we have, of course, but I call it 10,000 as easy for everyone to understand. And so that's a very different part of the market, but you're dealing with a very, very, very small segment of customers who could make the decision to do that. I mean, somebody who's buying a $10,000 guitar isn't saving up for it. A violin, yes. A cello, yes. Those people will save up. They'll get a mortgage for a vintage instrument, but with a guitar, anybody who's buying a $10,000
$1 million,
that's, yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. But if you're buying a $10,000 guitar, you're taking the vacation where you want to take it. You eat what you want. You drive what you want. That person can buy.
No, I certainly don't have any statistics to back that up, but my intuition and experience tells me that is true. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. It's different than, say, the classical guitar
market. I'm into
a
new world myself in that. Mm-hmm. We were making these new Finn guitars, and they're 100% carbon fiber, produced here in the U.S. And frankly, selling these guitars at under $10,000, $8,000 or $9,000 or $10,000, we still have a very low margin. A profit margin. In other words, these guitars are costing us a lot of money, and so now we're projected into the boutique market, which I am so grateful there is a boutique market, because this is part of the development process. My personal long-term goals, are to make things more affordable. But right now we have an extremely high-end instrument made in the U.S. by Patrick Sanker, who is incredibly capable fabricator and guitar player, and someone who's dedicated a lot of heart and soul into working with us. Even though he could make more money from General Motors making carbon fiber fenders or whatever, he's excited about guitars. And but these guitars, no matter how you slice it, they're basically in your $10,000 range if we are to survive making them. So, and then I hope over time, to develop a higher, right now, I spent all these years dedicated to Bode electric instruments, which again, I want to emphasize, I am still dedicated to that work I've done and continue to do, but I took a little bit of a hiatus in the guitar world, having to do with a lot of factors, the fact that Gibson bought Steinberger and so on, and I was looking for some kind of new identity to where I would have freedom of expression that might be inhibited by making guitars after I sold my company to another company, right? So you can imagine. So I'm very glad I did that, and have so enjoyed and continue to enjoy my work with Bode Electrics, which is its own challenge. When I started out with Bode the electric violin, I remember I put this ad in Strings magazine for 2 times. Once, separated by a month or whatever, and the ad basically picture of our new violin and a little bit of description of what it was about, so we could measure the level of interest in the marketplace, maybe sell a couple of them. Pick a round number to describe the response we got for that.
The most round number, 0. Yeah. Doesn't get any more round than 0.
That's it. That was it. 0. I didn't hear a peep from anybody, and we invested, not the big, a couple of half-page ads. It's not that big a deal, but still it was
but
an
thousands,
investment.
probably.
And
Yep.
I don't even know why I kept going, but I had already put so much into it. I didn't want to give up. And it has changed so much, which is very interesting to see. I mean, the violin, electric violin, viola, cello world, and so on, that's very, very tiny compared to guitars, electric guitars. But it's actually coming on stronger and stronger, and the interest is there, and it's very fun for me to be part of connecting all the opportunities that you have with electric instruments to bowed players, because, even on the most basic level, you're playing a wedding or some kind of event, and you're up there on stage, and nobody's paying any attention to you or hearing you at all because you're not loud enough, right? So this is a way to give string players an opportunity to join in on, and there are commercial opportunities for them. They could play a wedding or what have you and make it work, get another gig and all that. So it's very fun to be part of that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Actually, I saw a few of your instruments recently at a guitar pedal event. So there was in the city of Ottawa, which is not so far from where I live. It was a pedal show. So boutique pedal makers, these people who are making pedals in a small environment. They invited a couple of guitar makers because they need guitars to try the pedals. And so I went to see a couple of these guitar makers there, and actually there were 2 or 3 people, not a lot, but that were there checking out all the pedals with electric violins.
God bless them.
Yeah. But they were clearly inspired by the same thing.
We talk about conservatism we talk about conservatism in the guitar world.
Yeah.
Trust me, in the violin world, it's a whole nother dimension of conservatism. Yeah. And also, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but just to perfectly frank, ignorance too. Violinists, they just don't know about this stuff. I mean, guitar players, the electric guitars are always part, and they learn about pedals and all. But violin players, it's like, I had one customer, this was a while ago, violin player, contact us and say, well, I'm not getting a lot of sound out of the violin. What am I supposed to do? And, well, do you have an amplifier? An amplifier?
Oh man. I saw where that was going. I was like, oh no.
That's the exception, of course. And by the way, this person was probably a very talented musician, and I'm not, again, being critical, but just pointing out that it's a different world for string players, and it's new for them, and actually it's fun to see people getting excited and exploring new things. And it's kind of like the period of exploration for the guitar is kind of, I'm not saying anybody can't explore an electric guitar further or take anything away from, but still that it's a challenge, because so much exploration has already, so many of the lands have been discovered. But with the violin, actually, there's more opportunity there to explore new territory because it hasn't been explored so much already.
It baffles me that you're saying this, and I think it's fantastic because, Ned, I know a number of guitar makers in Europe, particularly, who are trained violin makers. They all left the violin because there was no room for personal expression. And you're telling the exact opposite story. You're 180 degrees because of your selling of the Steinberger company to Gibson. In that way, you actually saw opportunity in violin, when I know so many people who left the bowed instrument world because they thought there was no room for them to express themselves there. And
I'm sympathetic, and it is tough, but it's changing. And that's what's very interesting. And it's changing for a variety, for different reasons. But certainly one of the reasons is that, one of the reasons why the violin was late is because a magnetic pickup, which is a really easy way to electrify your instrument
Mm-hmm.
is no good for a violin.
Mm-hmm.
A violin, to sound really good, and that's the acoustic violin design, which has an asymmetrical structure to it and so on. It's all about converting side-to-side vibration into something to pump the top, so you get this, because it's all side-to-side. When you pluck a guitar, it's just a whole different ballgame. So a magnetic pickup just happened to fit perfectly for an acoustic guitar, and very imperfectly for a violin because of the direction of sensitivity. So it wasn't really until piezo technology was made more evident to ignoramuses like me, and we actually figured it out, that this is the way to go. Took a little while. This piezo technology is more from the 50s and 60s, I think, 1950s and 60s, probably 40s too, whatever. But it wasn't really so available until maybe, the 80s. And that's when I, started to get hip to it and be able to learn about how it works and incorporate that into a pickup design that is very sensitive to the side-to-side vibration on the bridge. That's the key to a bowed sound. So there's a reason why the violin is late, not just because violinists are so conservative, and they are generally, but also because the technology that is suitable for an electric violin came a little later.
And so you're using piezo technology in your bowed instruments, and are you using it in a traditional, just sort of compressed way, or what sort of piezo element are you using?
Well, piezos are pressure-sensitive devices.
Yes.
And so the key to what we're doing and by the way, I'm a big believer in the value of a piezo pickup on an electric guitar as a way to, one of the beautiful things about an electric instrument is that you can create a more varied palette of sound. With an acoustic instrument, different techniques you use to play make it sound very different and so on. I mean, and it's I love acoustic instruments, but they have sort of, if you play the instrument in a certain way, it will respond in a certain way. But with an electric instrument, you can get it to respond in all different ways through the way that you control the electronic response. And so that's a wonderful thing. And I like to, in my work, to try to offer as wide a palette as possible to them. I don't want to tell a musician what he's supposed or she is supposed to sound like, or they are supposed to sound like. I want to give them the opportunity to find that sound that's working for a particular tune or for the kind of music they play or so on. So having an electric guitar with a magnetic pickup system and a piezo pickup system, hey, the piezo isn't going to keep you from having your electric sound, your magnetic sound, excuse me. And of course, many musicians, and I also respect this enormously, they don't want to be flipping switches and figuring out which sound is which. That's not what their music is about. They want to pick up an instrument and play it. They don't want to play around with technology. And so all kinds of people out there with different orientations. And anyway, allowing them to find the sound that works for them is where I'm at. And it does add a complication. If you have choices, then, you want to sit down and play a piece of music, and now you got to figure out which way to put the switches and all that. I mean, who needs it if that's not where you want to be,
right?
Where you want to live.
Attention all headless guitar builders. Introducing the NS Fulcrum Individual Bridge Tuner. The Fulcrum is the culmination of Ned Steinberger's 45 years of headless guitar design. Featuring a patented self-clamping mechanism, the Fulcrum Bridge Tuner allows quick, toolless string changes and is compatible with all commonly available guitar strings. The top-mounted, low-friction tuning knob and individual tuner design allows for unprecedented flexibility in your next headless guitar design. So lose your head with Ned. Available now at nshardware.bigcartel.com. That's nshardware.bigcartel.com. So let me clarify my question a little bit more. Maybe it's a little too technical, but there are a few different ways you can use a piezo pickup. And so the most common way is to put it under the string where it's receiving different levels of compression, right? So when it presses in on the piezo crystal, the crystal releases an electrical charge, right? And so it's that compression point where it releases the charge, and that's what we translate into sound at that point in time. But you can also load a piezo crystal within an element where the element is hitting it on the points of amplitude, where there's a piezo inside an element and it smacks between the two different inside casers. Does that make sense? So you have the ceiling and the bottom, and the element moves within this. Okay, and they're more prone to feedback, those types. And so most people use the compression style of it, where it's just under a string. And so the most common thing would be like a Fishman
style. The only thing I've ever done is have it, pressure sensitive. I've never had it float around. It's kind of which is interesting, because there are certain piezo pickup elements that are quite popular that I don't quite get how they work. But in my case, it's always been you change the pressure on the sensor, piezo sensor, crystal, whatever, and you get a signal from that, and that's what I work.
Yeah. So with that, the biggest challenge is the time problem. And let me explain the time problem. So it's a very immediate response. And so often a piezo element or piezo pickup can sound quite harsh, and we find ways to, through reverb,
the quack,
through compression,
about, right?
Yeah, the quack that we're talking about. And the thing is, it's a very immediate response. And so when we're dealing with a membrane which has a movement, there's a bit of a latency sort of built into it, a bit of a cushion built into it. And so the cushion is kind of mostly absent or imperceivable with the piezo pickup, and that sort of immediate response is there. And so in my terms of the way I think about physics being movement in time and then perception, that I think it would be helpful to figure out how to insert time into the equation of the piezo pickup. But of course, it only works because of the compression, which means the response is still fast and immediate. But the human ear typically wants to hear a little bit more of a graduated response, because in nature, it's usually more of a graduated, it's coming from a distance to us. That's the time element. And so how do you deal with the immediacy? I see it as a problem. So that's the primary difference, is that when you get a violin going, a bowed instrument, or any of the bowed instruments, cello, doesn't matter, there is a blossoming of the sound. And that blossoming is the disadvantage on a piezo pickup, is it doesn't blossom in the same way. Have you dealt with that in your design?
I hear what you're saying there, and it's interesting. Certainly, any kind of pickup is not going to absolutely reproduce the effect of the sound to the audience that you would have without it. Mm-hmm. But what this quack is all about is a quote unquote quack is all about. Mm-hmm. Still something I'm trying to understand. I do a lot of work with Mikhail Ioffa, who is the mastermind behind my Psi acoustic pickups and circuitry and so on. The super capacitor, which is just so absolutely awesome, where you just plug it in for a minute and then you can play your gig with plenty to spare, and you don't have to worry about batteries ever again. He has talked to me about the so-called quack and his new capacitor pickup, which is in principle quack free. And I do have a tremendous, there's he's not making it up. When there's something different there that he believes eliminates the quack. I never heard I don't have great ears. I never heard the quack in my life, but I understand it's an issue. So I guess the story I'm getting to is that I was presenting this. I have an acoustic guitar project that you know about that I've been working on, and I was presenting. I was meeting with an old friend who's a solo artist, guitar player and singer and piano player, and he gigs around and so on. And he tested out this new pickup that I wanted him to get. I wanted to get his feedback on. And I won't mention any names, but he said to me, well, I like the pickup, but it has an awful lot of quack. Okay, so here is this pickup that was supposed to have no quack by an expert, and now you have a musician who says it has a lot of quack. So it certainly points out that the difficulty I face trying to get feedback on things and understand how they're working or not working. And it also points out how incredibly, we talked about it before, how incredibly subjective our world is. So there you go.
The third part of the equation I mentioned is perception.
Right.
Yeah, it's movement plus time and perception. The perception's a hard one because, exactly as you just talked about.
But it's also the most important one, isn't it?
It is the most important one. So you have to kind of work with averages to a certain amount. But every once in a while, you have to identify. I remember there was somebody who really passionate about guitar and involved themselves with somebody who was really great at designs but didn't make guitars. And so they were manufacturing these great illustrations of guitar. And he would bring me these guitars over a period of many years, more than a decade, that I would actively see this person. He'd always, Jamie, come check out these guitars. And they always looked really interesting, but they never played. And eventually I had to say to him, I said, listen, man, I see you're really passionate about this and you want to make this happen. I said, you need to find yourself a really good musician who's extremely disagreeable, somebody who's really hard to please. Because it seems to me that what's obvious to me now is that for whatever reason, you don't have the capacity to judge these instruments. So you need to align yourself. If you want to be successful in this, you need to align yourself with somebody who can really judge these instruments. Somebody who's a really good, proven musician, who's extremely disagreeable, who tells you, no, it doesn't work.
I get your point. I get your point, Jamie, but one guy is not enough. It's everybody.
Oh no, it would be a start though for this guy, so and then find more.
To get that feedback, because I'm in the same position as this gentleman you're speaking of. I depend on feedback from musicians to understand whether I'm meeting my goals. Of course, my goals are, to make an instrument that is helps a musician to enjoy making music and make the best music they can, and so on. That's the goal. Making tools for musicians. And most people who make instruments are players, and they kind of make their own judgment and follow that, which I think is totally cool. I mean, what could make more sense than that? But for those of us who are not musicians, who are making instruments, which is a tremendous, a minority for sure.
But some really important ones, like Leo Fender, as you already mentioned, was one of those people. He did all right. You've done all right.
He did okay. I mean, he could have done better, but I mean, whatever. So but I think, in my case, certainly, I'm following certain principles of understanding that I have about how the instrument works. And which are not fully developed. I don't understand completely how the instrument works, but I understand a lot about it, and I try to work with what I know to make an instrument that would offer opportunity for a musician, that would make it fun to play. And, for example, balance. I mean, that's how I really got into it because, I was working as a cabinet maker / furniture designer very early in a career there. with some limited success and moving forward and so on. And then I had, I don't know, was it an opportunity or whatever. Anyway, I got to meet Stuart Spector, who was part of this co-op I was working with in Brooklyn, and he was into guitars, and I was fascinated by that. And then there was this issue with, maybe there was a bass, the customers wanted a bass, and so I said, let me work on that. And I mean, the thing that really ultimately drew me in to this world that I've been in now for the last 50 years, which is crazy, but was about ergonomics and balance and so on. And so there's all different. So I followed that concept, and tried to get input from musicians about it. But I had an idea of something that I thought would be beneficial that they didn't have. They didn't ask me for a headless bass. They didn't come in and want a custom instrument without a headstock. I mean, forget it. So having some kind of vision, of something that you think might be of value, then you try to see where you can go with that. And the first headless bass I made was a complete disaster. But still, you don't have to be a musician to make tools for musicians. But it probably, and it helps in a way to be a musician for sure. But in a lot of ways, it's helped for me not to be a musician, because I think it gives me a certain objectivity, a certain interest in musicians. If you're making an instrument for yourself, and then there's probably a lot of people who are like you and they might want that instrument, that's great. But if you're making an instrument that's not for yourself but for players in general, then maybe you have a more open mind and maybe there's opportunity there. I think so.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And there's other examples of that. Although I couldn't justify it, but I've heard it said many times to me that the best piano tuners are not musicians. And
I can believe that, definitely.
Yeah. And so tuning a piano is complicated.
You need to be distracted by music if you're tuning a piano. I mean, I don't mean anything derogatory about a piano tuner, but I mean, it's a technical thing, and if you got to have a good ear, or nowadays you have to have the right machine, right? I mean, I depend. I mean, actually design these e-tuners for, I work with the Dario on these different kind of products and tuners, and but I depend on tuners to just tune up the guitar when I make a guitar and see how it's playing and so on. I don't do it by ear. No way.
Yeah. So, you said something a few moments ago, which I want to go back to for a second, and probably a little bit unexpected for you, but you were a furniture maker and designer. And recently I read a book by a studio furniture maker who actually has a school in Maine. Maybe not so far from you. I'm not sure where he is.
Center for what's it called? I can't remember the name.
So there's a book. I actually have it here on my desk, to be honest. It's called, a plug for them right now. It's Why We Make Things and Why It Matters. The Education of a Craftsman. It's Peter Korn is the and he came up in the studio furniture movement, the same one that I suspect you're talking about, that he didn't know was a movement at the time, but now retrospectively he can look back and realize.
What does studio furniture mean? I don't even really know what you mean by that.
So people handcrafting furniture.
Okay.
Basically, not.
I was never into handcrafting furniture. I was into production furniture, for what it's worth.
Production furniture. Okay, but there was sort of a movement that happened in the 60s and sort of 70s, and he even had a studio in New York City at the back in this sort of probably the same sort of time period you're sort of talking about also. And there's lots of co-ops and ceramicists and studio furniture makers and handcrafted people basically were doing things. Anyways, so you were part of a co-op? Or Stuart Spector was part of the co-op?
Okay, I was part of a co-op, and it had nothing to do with furniture design. But it really had to do with woodworkers. It was the woodworking co-op. I was extremely attracted to the co-op because of the low overhead that came from being part of something with six or eight other partners or whatever, co-op members. It was extremely informal. There were no legal documents or anything like that. Back in the day, we were children, basically. And so it was a great opportunity for me, again, I fed myself making cabinets for rich New Yorkers, which I kind of liked the cabinet making part of it. I didn't really like some other parts of it. Shall we say?
Always great. Yeah.
And so, when and I was interested in design up from a young age. I started out, making stuff at 12 years old, and I'm kind of a kind of dyslexic, I guess, and I didn't really do a lot of reading and so on. I just sort of figured stuff out, made stuff. It was great for me as a fairly lonely child. And so one thing led to another. Then I was there at age 22 or 3 or so, working, making cabinets for people to, make a living and doing different kind of. I was into chairs. See, that's how I got into guitars, because chairs and guitars have a lot more in common from my perspective than they would from most people, because of the ergonomic aspect of it. And that's what made me interested in chairs, is the complexity of shapes to fit your body that make it comfortable and still attractive and economical to produce and all of that stuff. And I actually got a job as an intern with a company. I designed some furniture that they produced. That was very, very fun for me at a young age. And then, anyway, at a certain point, I made the connection with Stuart, which was the best connection of my whole career, in that I worked on that, the NS Spectre instrument, which I always struggled with the weight of the headstock. And so that's when I decided, to explore headless. That's what drew me in for a lifetime, because I just felt like this might be a tough sell, but damn, this is cool, and so here we are.
Here you are. Not all of our listeners will know the actual story behind it, and we don't need to go into great detail. Someday you and I should actually record your biography together. I would love to do that. I've been making a document where I'm actually recording biographies of guitar makers on the new Boutique Guitar Showcase website, and I'm trying to gather together the greatest sort of. Yeah, so we should do that. But let's give the sort of the Coles notes, we might say, the clip notes here with. So your Stuart Spector has asked you to collaborate somehow on an electric bass design. Can you just tell people how this sort of headless thing, which you're most famous for, happened?
How did it happen? Basically, it happened because I'm struggling with the balance of this bass. It's neck heavy, and no matter what, in those days you couldn't get these beautiful Goto lightweight tuners and stuff. It was all like heavy tuning hardware hanging on the end of this long neck, right? And it's going. That's who wants that, and so at some point, I remember looking down at the instrument and going, well, I could take the weight there on the end of the neck. I could put it on the body. What about that? That's the beginning of it right there. I did it. So I did a very poor job of it the first time, and second time got better, and third time was better than that. And, it took a while, and I had some, I've told this story before, but it's such a great story. I made the original instruments I made I made a very lightweight wooden instrument, which was terrible. I did various experiments with that and determined that it needed to be much stiffer and needed to have some heft to it, that I had it completely wrong. And that's one thing, mistakes, failures, this is a kind of a, what's the word for it? Some kind of saying or whatever, that you learn from your mistakes and how important that is. But it's certainly, in my case, totally true. And so I learned so much from how far off I was initially. I started to rethink how to do it, and I got into the idea of carbon fiber and stiffness and having a certain weight and stiffness combination to get that ringing, sustained tone for all across the range of the instrument. And then I built a plaster mold, because when I went to art school, I learned about making plaster molds, and made a plaster mold and made put carbon fiber in it and made a pretty good instrument. It had its issues, but from a performance standpoint, it was actually great. But maybe the paint tended to peel off it and stuff like that. Of various issues. But then I decided, well, let's do it right. Let's make a fiberglass mold. I'll make it. I did it all myself. So I made a pattern, a model, and then I molded against that with fiberglass, and a tremendous amount of work went into that, months. And then I molded the part in there. I got all the carbon fiber and all that. Took in a lot of money, went into all this. I had no money back then to speak of. And I put it all together and clamped it up, and everything went well. And then the next day I went to take it apart, and it never happened. I glued that whole goddamn thing together, even though I put release in there, right? And I didn't get it right. And that's in the bottom of some dump someplace, all one piece. I could never separate it.
That's fantastic.
That was the hard way. That was the hard way. So anyway,
that's great.
It gives you a little bit of a sense of what was involved in trying to get from point A to point B. And anyway.
Okay. And there was material exploration involved there also. So the carbon fiber and those instruments were not. Did they have a wood core or not? There was something else involved.
What eventually evolved was essentially a carbon fiber neck. Yeah. A mostly fiberglass body. Back in those days, carbon fiber was exceedingly expensive. It's still expensive, but not like it was back then. And so there were economic considerations there, but also I wanted the body to be heavy. The beauty of carbon fiber is the stiffness to weight ratio, which is fabulous, very stiff. And stiffness is huge on a guitar. Especially on the neck, you see the stiffness of if I have a stick. Okay, I don't see a stick here. Look. Okay. None of these things are rectangular right now. So, all right, let's just take this little guy I happen to have right here. Too small, but whatever. Let's see if it works. So if we look at this stick, we bend it, right? You can see I can bend it pretty easily.
Some flex.
If I make this stick twice as thick in the direction I'm trying to bend it, it's not twice as stiff. It's not 4 times as stiff. It's 8 times as stiff, the cube of the height. So your neck is where the flex is, because your body is much thicker and wider and so on. So your body is essentially stiff and your neck is essentially relatively flexible. And that's where the energy of the string gets sucked out of the system because the neck flexes sympathetically with the string and sucks instead of holding the ends rigid, so the string the energy of the string is not being transferred to something else too much. It always somewhat, it's all about a degree. But anyway, the stiffer the structure and the heavier the structure, the more the string vibration is isolated in the string, the longer it will sustain, and those other qualities, the more high-end harmonics will have, and so on. So that's something I learned early on. And that's always been a principle I've applied to my work. Not everybody wants that sound. I get that. Some people want, more of a thuddy sound. Okay.
Yeah.
Thuddy is kind of negative, so that's not the right word for it.
No,
but a more,
it's neither here nor there. I get it.
Thump at the beginning, or more percussive in a sense, because the sound, if it sustains well, it's less percussive because it. If it's a flexible structure, it will lose its sustain and everything. So the initial attack is more pronounced. So it depends on what you want. But to me, that's what electric sound kind of is all about, is that option, to be sustained, to have all those high harmonics and everything just hang in there and drift off and all that. That's where I'm at, and not all musicians are looking for that. But if you are looking for that, then there's a place to go for it. And a lot of musicians do enjoy that. I have no doubt about it. It's a matter of preference.
Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives, making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world, where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive. Those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon at patreon.com/business of guitar. That's patreon.com/business of guitar. So Ned, with these instruments, even now, you're choosing to use a manufactured material in your newest of designs, the Finn guitar that you referenced already with carbon fiber. And so why do you choose these manufactured materials over the more accepted wood in this scenario?
Very good question, frankly, and not one with a simple answer. But to begin with, I didn't actually choose it quite to the extent that you might think, in the sense that, first of all, I learned early on the benefits structurally from carbon fiber. The high stiffness to weight ratio is something I believe in. Again, not every musician likes it, but those who do, it's like there's nothing quite like it. I mean, you just get this ringing tone that you don't quite get with wood. So that's fun for me. That's how and again, the reason I got into carbon fiber to begin with was because I had failed so miserably with a very flexible, lightweight wooden structure that just didn't have sustain, and it was all, every note sounded different from the next one, and there was very little consistency in the fingerboard and so on. So I sort of did a little experimentation. I said, wow, stiffness is very, very important, and having a sufficient weight is very important, and that's been the guiding thing for me for all these years. So I love making instruments out of carbon fiber, but when you take a look, for example, this is a Finn guitar here, okay, and I don't know if you can see it on the screen there, but how beautiful in its own way the finish is with carbon fiber, and the ability to build a lightweight instrument. This thing weighs 5.5 pounds. it's stiff as all hell. It has also really an evolution of the technology, because this fingerboard is all carbon fiber. Steinberger instruments used phenolic on the fingerboard, which is frankly, that doesn't compare structurally with the carbon fiber. And so it's really exciting to be able to have an instrument like this made entirely out of carbon fiber, and it has a unique, fantastic sound, and it's a great opportunity too, to develop all this tuning hardware and so on that we're doing. It's all part of that. And so, but my original concept for this instrument wasn't all about carbon fiber. It was about the ergonomics of it, the shape, and how it works for a musician, and also how it expresses a certain kind of energy. That to me is what an electric guitar is all about, and talk about going into the future and what an electric guitar can be in the future. So carbon fiber fit right in with that, but on the other hand, it wasn't fundamental to it. There's two ways I think about making a really great guitar. One is all carbon fiber. That's certainly very, very cool in my book, and it takes it to an extreme. But there's also the option of making an instrument that is made from wood, but which has carbon fiber reinforcement in the neck. And lots of instruments have some kind of little pieces of carbon fiber in the neck. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about making a neck with a tubular carbon structure inside the wood that is seriously stiff compared to wood. Benefit of that being, one, the tonal benefit, of having a really stiff neck and having all that ringing, sustain, and so on, but also dependability. Because if the neck is essentially, it looks like wood, it feels like wood, but inside it's super rigid compared to wood, and not susceptible to humidity and temperature changes. So this instrument now is dependable. Your action and everything remains consistent throughout the season and so on. But still, you get to feel a piece of maple while you're playing it, which is, I like to feel a maple myself. I'm not a musician, but I like.
Do you make instruments like that?
Do I make what?
Do you make instruments in the way you're describing, with a wooden neck?
I have made instruments like that, and never in production.
Okay.
But the point is, these are all kind of a new dimension in guitars and basses, of course. And so for me, there's two different ways to make it that really make sense. One is to make a wooden instrument where the neck is seriously reinforced by carbon fiber. That's what I consider a high-performance instrument.
Yeah.
But has the feel and the look of wood, which I love wood too. I mean, I've been working in carbon fiber all these years, but I'd much rather carve a piece of wood than a piece of carbon fiber. I can tell you that any day. And, there's something really beautiful about wood that it's not lost on me. So there's a way to combine a wooden instrument with a reinforced neck using, modern materials that I think has got a lot of value, not just for electric either, but for acoustic as well. I think.
No, we work with an acoustic guitar maker called Dion James, who does exactly what you're talking about. So there's a
there's nothing new in it, right?
A sphere, like basically half a tube in there, and the wood is laid back inside it also. And so it's wood on the outside. There's a spherical carve, the long tube, and the wood is inlaid back in that sort of half tube. And so it's mostly wood, but that structure of the carbon fiber provides that stiffness that you're describing there. And he doesn't make that many guitars, maybe 10 guitars a year or something of the sort. But he's doing that on a small hand.
I applaud that. And, I don't reach out enough and get to meet enough people doing this kind of work, but I'd love to be introduced to this gentleman. And we're in agreement about the benefit of
Yeah.
And the other thing too.
Well, if you remember, ask me at a NAMM show, because he's often at the NAMM show with us. And if you remember, the next time we're at the show, I'll introduce you to. You can talk about it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Great. So we were talking about materials, and we were talking about your designs. And so there's a couple of things here, I want to be conscious of our time a little bit here. And we've talked a lot about sort of historically the things that you're sort of most famous for. But there's two things that I was hoping to sort of discuss that I think are useful. One, you mentioned that you do some work for D'Addario, and it's there are a few guitar makers in the world who have made a substantial amount of their income from yes, their guitars, but when I think of the work that you're doing, and that I think the capo. I think I actually have. Did you design the capo for Planet Waves? I think you did.
I think most of those capos are mine. Yeah, they might have some older versions.
I have one on my desk here. I think this is.
Yes.
I think this is one of your designs here. The strap locks. You mentioned tuners and such. Another person I can think of is Trevor Wilkinson, who is a guitar maker, but Trevor's definitely made. I'd be surprised if he's ever made as much money making guitars as he has from his hardware. And
Trevor and I go way back, by the way. He's a fine fellow and a great inventor. And are you interested in little stories or whatever that might be fun?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
give us a little.
Trevor and I, when I really got to meet Trevor, it's funny because he was making tremolos. I was making tremolos. I sold Steinberger Sound to Gibson Company, and there was a certain amount of conflict between what Trevor was doing and what I had done. This question of what prior art and who had the right to which and all. And so Henry Juskowitz, I don't know if you ever heard of Henry Juskowitz, but
we've all heard of Henry.
The author of Gibson.
Infamous.
And so he decided to sue Trevor over different things. And so I became an expert witness on behalf of...
Was that the second Gibson lawsuit? There's been two now, right? The Gibson's made two lawsuits. Is that right? That's me being completely facetious. Yeah. I think 100 is low, actually. Carry on. The most litigious company in our industry, I think, is the amount of times I've gotten emails and phone calls from guitar makers going, "Oh my God, I just got a letter from Gibson." But that's another story. So carry on. So
I don't want to go there. So
there was a lawsuit, and there was some questions.
There was a deposition, okay, and I was the expert witness on behalf of Gibson. And I had known Trevor before, but not well. We got to know each other better at the deposition, and I wasn't. I answered the questions as honestly as I could. That was my job. I wasn't really I wasn't enthusiastic about this whole thing. It was like, give me a break. Mm-hmm. Why do we need to have lawsuits around stuff like this? Let's innovate. Let's do, and if it's really, really nasty theft, okay. But if it's kind of questionable, let's just not go there. I mean, that's where I'm at. Mm-hmm. So I ended up mostly defending Trevor in this deposition because I was on his side in my heart. Again, I didn't make up stuff. I just answered the questions, but my bias was mixed. Anyway, we got to know each other over the years, and we have new projects we're doing right now. We're doing something, we're developing this new product called the Activator. I mentioned Mikhail Ioffa of my side company. He has, this incredible circuitry that's driven by supercapacitors, and so of course he's completely in the acoustic world. So I'm trying to see how this can be applied to electric guitars. And this Finn guitar has this feature, right? You pull up on this knob here, push pull. This is a passive system, guitar system, but you pull up on that, and now the activator kicks in gives you a variable level boost, everything low impedance. And when you push this back down again, it's back to passive, absolutely unaffected, the passive system. So you really have live in two worlds. And Trevor is part of this whole development process we're doing. It's all a lot of fun and exciting, and I think it actually is a really great. You can get something that you can put into your Fender Strat, your Les Paul. Those are acoustic instruments. Passive instruments. And now you keep the original sound 100%. With a flip of a switch, you go low impedance, and you can increase the level substantially if you want for like leads, added distortion, and so on. So anyway, you brought up Trev, and we go way back. I got a lot of respect for Trev.
Great. Well, it's one of the things that's actually happened at the NAMM Show's Boutique Guitar Showcase is that we've had a lot of things that guitar makers aren't conscious of are these other opportunities. And when you come to something like the NAMM Show, where most of the industry is there, you end up with these offers to design something for another company, or, hey, that innovation that you've got there, could we license that from you? So on and so forth. That kind of stuff happens. And that's, I think, has been a part of your career, a part of Trevor Wilkinson's career, and I'm sure there's a number of other people we could mention where that's exactly what happened. And so, to me, one of the key things for business in general is that show up, go where the people who are doing things are. You don't know what's going to happen. But I guarantee you, nothing truly remarkable is going to happen to you sitting at home in front of your screen.
Okay,
you got to get out there and show up. And I think that that you're there. And we interacted this last year. You're always on to new things. You've shown me some of the new innovations you're working on today. You've been innovating already for so many decades. This is your 50 years ish, approximately at this point in time, almost 50 years.
It's 50 years.
Coming up. Right. And at this point, I think that if you're going to make a career in this industry, it's really important to show up. I can't tell you how many places I've seen Trevor Wilkinson. I know I've seen him in many countries.
He's a traveler. He is,
That's right.
I'm less so. And, for example, we're very excited about the Mannheim show, right? I'm sure.
Yes, I'll be there.
I will not be there. Okay. I'm not planning to be there because.
But I've seen Trevor there. I know I talked to Trevor.
Trevor's there. We're going to have Hap Kuffner's going to be there. We're going to be. Actually, it's a very big show for us because we're going to be introducing our Finn instruments and making them for sale for the first time,
Okay.
And also the hardware that we're doing, the tuning hardware that we've developed that's going to be available for luthiers. All that's going to have its introduction there. So it's a big deal. I'm not going because I got COVID at the NAMM show. And I don't know. I'm a wimp. What can I tell you? So we'll see. Maybe I'll even show up. But these shows are important. That's for sure. And but I'm not necessarily the front man for what we do. I'm sort of behind the scenes. I guess that's an oversimplification, maybe, but. I certainly got a lot out of this last NAMM show. I got, in addition to COVID, I got a lot of other stuff out of the NAMM show.
Yes.
So I got to keep that in mind. But
I think I got COVID at the 2020 show before we knew what COVID was.
I think I did too.
It's not unusual to come home sick from a trade show or from traveling. We do so much intense work coming into these environments. I'm one of these people. Maybe you've had this too. If we have spare time, that's just time for us to do something else, and we fill it immediately. And so if you go on vacation, if it's like holidays or something that's like that, many people like myself, we get sick the first couple of days of a holiday or a vacation because our body says, oh, you're stopped? I can I can deal with this now.
Lesson here, don't go on vacation, Jamie, okay? It's just
the point is, I'm not actually sure that it's the environment, although it very likely could be. I'm not so sure it's the environment of travel and such. I think it also has a lot to do with how intensely we work towards getting into it, and that we don't necessarily take the time to take care of ourselves when we're doing that. So you definitely are putting yourself at more risk, but there are ways to do it. And so some of the things I try to, I don't go out to parties anymore at the show. I have a very high liquid intake. Like green vegetable juices, and
you're not talking bourbon
lots
here.
and lots and lots of liquids. No, I'm not talking bourbon. I'm talking about green vegetable juices and water constantly. I almost go on a completely liquid diet during the NAMM show now. Really? Because I used to dry out so much, and we talk the whole time, right? And so taking care of yourself, making sure you're there, that's important. So Ned, I think that we should wrap up this part of the interview. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that if I were a better interview, I would have asked you?
I don't think so. I think that you're a great interviewer and participant. And I think if I might say that I'm very excited about re-engaging in the guitar world, which I have been, sort of focused on, again, the Bode electrics for all these years. And now I'm at the twilight of my career or whatever, and in making musical instruments, designing musical instruments, but I'm far from done. I can say that for sure. I'm very, very engaged, and taking this opportunity to put together all these things I've learned over all these years. And, for example, this guitar here we were just talking about, and the bass also version of this. These are things that represent a lifetime of commitment to musical instruments and making tools for artists. And so I'm just very excited about continuing my work and sharing that with the musicians and seeing where that goes. And very grateful for this opportunity to chat with you about all that.
Okay. Well, that's great. I love the fact that you are a veteran in our industry, and that you're talking about being excited about the work you're doing, because that is super important for me.
So here's one thing. The work I did earlier, I'm interrupting here, and my wife is always telling me to stop interrupting, but whatever. The thing is that work has been referred to as retro. In other words, like an original Steinberger guitar is some kind of ancient thing or whatever. I don't know. I have a hard time really wrapping my brain around that, but I don't. Yeah, I want to keep looking to the future. That's where I'm at.
I have a personal tagline I use a lot with the Boutique Guitar Showcase that says, "I love where we've been, but I'm excited about where we're going." And I think that probably resonates for you too.
It does, 100%, Jamie.
Yeah. So, listen, for our audience here, we're going to wrap up this part of Life with Strings Attached. For those of you that follow us on Patreon, we're going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes talking about the business of guitar. And so Ned's been in the business for a long time and has run successful companies and has had some interesting experience, including the selling of his name, which I want to talk about in this next portion. If you want to hear that, then head on over to our Patreon. Thank you for watching and listening. You can find more episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. And a special thanks to those who support us on Patreon. It's your support that enables us to do this work.